Hello friends, this is Marilyn from Tarot Clarity again, and this is the second video in a series in support of the idea that the occultists of the last century or so assign meanings to the numbered major arcana cards based on the numbered pip cards and not the other way around. I'll be doing a video for each of the first 10 numbered arcana cards, and then I'll go beyond the first 10 to explore numbers 11 through 21 of the major arcana and the first 10 numbers. I think this series will most interest people who already read or are learning to read TDM-style decks, because these are the decks that I'm using to make my case. And by TDM, I'm referring to decks originating in both northern Italy as well as Marseille, France. This particular video will focus on the deuces in relation to the Popess or High Priestess card. If you like what you hear in my videos, please be generous and give it a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe to my channel so you'll always be aware when I release the next video. I want to reinforce out of the gate that not all tarot readers subscribe to reading the cards based on numerical associations with its respective suit, but it has been my approach, and when I teach TDM to my students, this is the approach I generally use, because I think it makes great sense to learn it in this way. Once a reader has established a strong foundation between associating the numbers with their suits, it makes our readings more consistent and eliminates the need to memorize meanings. Everyone has a right to find their own way, a way that can be consistent, and because it makes sense to them, it'll work. Any good student does his or her own research in search of finding a method that works for them. These videos describe my approach and are not universal truth. They describe my understanding and my relationship with the cards that I've based my understanding on from information that others have written, and it only seems fair to me to share what I know, or at least what I think I know. Some people read TDM without making any connections between numbers and suit, and with very little understanding of historic associations of the major arcana cards. They go strictly by how the cards look together to create a story, and I do that on occasion myself. But along with associating the numbers with their suits, I also subscribe to understanding where the major arcana cards are coming from. Even if I have to make up a story, we may never really know the absolute truth about these cards, and their original sources. But I think as long as we have a story to help us develop a personal understanding with each one of the major arcana cards, it serves us well while we're interpreting the cards. Every approach is valid, and as long as a person is consistent with his or her method, they should be able to yield accurate readings. What I'm trying to say is, there's no gospel truth or correct way to read the cards as long as a person has a genuine connection and internal understanding of them. What I describe in these videos is my own personal understanding, relationship, and approach to the cards. We also evolve as we learn more about the cards, and it's okay to adjust and adapt. I mean, who wants to stop learning? The nature of tarot is so endlessly fascinating that there is always something to learn. I've been reading a long time, and I'm still learning. If you haven't seen my video on the magician, then I encourage you to view that video first and then come back to watch this one for continuity. I also did a video on the Fool 1 or 2 videos ago, and that might interest you as well. I'll lump every video in this series in its own playlist. For the purpose of this video, I'm referencing 6 decks from left to right, which are more or less in chronological order. The Visconti Sforza Tarocchi deck, one of the oldest known decks to exist and is of Italian origin. This is a Lo Scarabeo deck based on the Pierpont Morgan. And I'll also be referencing the Yale Carey Visconti deck. I'll also probably reference the Sola Busca at some point. The Noblet is one of the oldest Tarot of Marseille decks out of France, followed by the Vieville deck, which is a kind of hybrid between Italian and French influences from around the same period of time as the Noblet. The next is a Dodal from the early 1700s. This particular one is recreated by Flornoy, followed by a deck based on the work of Oswald Worth, whose life spanned the late 1800s to the early to mid 1900s, and then finally the Rider-Waite Smith or the Waite Smith Tarot deck, which burst on the scene in 1910 and almost everyone is familiar with that deck. This particular version is a German publication by A.G. Müller. So before we try to understand what the second arcana is, let's get started by reflecting on what the number 2 means. Let's try to offer a definition for the number 2 if we had to explain its concept to someone. We might describe the 2s as the beginning of an accumulation of things. It's the first whole number that may be split in half. 2 cookies may be shared evenly between 2 people. Between 2 dots, a line can be drawn to connect them. So it might also be said that the number 2 is the number of shared experience. If we think of examples of people and things that come in 2s, they complete a set, like in 2 pairs of shoes or gloves or twins, or even the dynamic duo of Batman and Robin. But 2s don't always match. Sometimes conflicts and dualities are suggested with the number 2, as in the example of sunrise and sunset, night and day, North Pole and South Pole, man and woman, yin and yang, good and evil, etc. I think we might all agree, though, that these concepts are a common sense approach to understanding the nuanced concepts of the number 2. So let's now take those ideas and investigate the second card of the major arcana, which was originally known as the Popess or papess, and in more recent years is more commonly referred to as the High Priestess. Let's take a quick glimpse at an example from the Carey Yale Visconti deck. And excuse my reach. Hope you can see it. Apparently, there is no existing card designated as the Popess in this deck. So either the Popess card was lost, or it was just never part of this deck. There's also no corresponding female card for the female Pope in the Solabusca either. And, excuse my reach again, here we have 2 Solabusca decks. This one is a recent publication put out by U.S. Games, Inc., and I'm sorry for the glare. I hope that is good. And the other, which may produce a little bit better in video form, is from an out-of-print deck by Lo Scarabeo, titled The Illuminating Ancient Tarot. I show you these examples because they reinforce the reality that the earliest decks out of Italy did not all have a standard cast of tarot characters, the same number of cards, nor were the trump cards always necessarily numbered. They were not standardized in the way we generally recognize a deck of tarot cards today. Some of these early decks had 24 court cards instead of 12, because for each male character of the nobility there was a matching female counterpart. At some point, the court cards were abbreviated and standardized to only 12 court cards. Some modern deck creators will assign female characters to the pages, or sometimes to both the pages and the knights, usually of the suit of cups and coins, in an attempt to restore and equalize the female presence. But getting back to the Carey Yale deck, my guess is that in order to make the existing cards, let me turn off the overhead light. Oh, it still has a glare. So I hope you can see it well enough. My guess is that in order to make the existing cards of this particular deck marketable and palatable for modern readers, the deck, this particular card has been changed to do double duty as the Popess or the High Priestess. This card was originally identified as Charity. According to the booklet, which comes with the Carey Yale deck, this particular card has been identified as Charity, and the booklet says she's holding a blackened vessel. And if you look at it, a blackened vessel sort of suggests that it's supposed to be some type of chalice. But if you look closely at the object, it looks more like a mirror to me. I don't know if you see that, but a mirror, in which case, if it's a mirror, she would have been more closely associated with the virtue Prudence, who often holds a mirror in, renditions of the virtue of prudence. Furthermore, since there is no card identified as prudence in this deck, who even really knows if this woman is charity or prudence? But in any case, whoever this woman is, her similarities to the Popess is limited. She is wearing a crown. If you look at her carefully, you can see there is a crown, but it's not a triple crown. She does not appear alone, nor does she appear with a book. She has an infant, and she also is standing on top of a king, who is probably a king because he's also wearing a crown. Neither of them are wearing a triple tier crown. They're both wearing, a crown that's, more secular in nature. So that's more like the crown of a king or a queen. Now let's check out the Popess from the Pierpont Morgan, Visconti Sforza deck, who was a clear reference to the Popess character that eventually became known as the High Priestess. Aside from being a restored image and a crisp and clean copy of the original Pierpont Morgan card, this deck accurately recreates this card nonetheless. So let's scrutinize this Popess carefully to take stock of what she's wearing and the environment she's occupying. If we observe her attire, she kind of looks like a nun, dressed more or less in cream or white cloth from head to toe, and she's wearing the triple crown of a pope, the 3 tiers on the crown. She's holding a staff with a crucifix, if you can see it. She kind of blends in with the background of gold, but but along with the staff with the crucifix and the triple-tiered crown, they're both overt references to the papal office, Christianity and Catholicism in particular, since she's coming out of Italy. She's also holding a closed book on her lap. She's seated on what appears to be a bench rather than a throne, which is on a slightly elevated platform. It looks like she's in an outdoor setting with grass and a forest. You can't make it out maybe in this video, but there's a very tiny horizon of trees in the background. The sky is an elaborate high sheen with a patterned gold motif. Tarot historian Gertrude Moakley has done meticulous research suggesting that the woman depicted on this particular card is a documented ancestor of the Visconti family named Sister Manfreda, who lived about 150 years prior to when this deck had been created. I think she lived in like the late 1200s to the early 1300s. Now, Manfreda belonged to a small heretical religious sect in Lombardy, northern Italy, and her sect elected her as their pope. That obviously didn't go over well, and naturally she was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church for heresy. Since scholars question whether or not the Visconti family would have commemorated this inconvenient relative on an expensive artistic commission, the reason being that they almost certainly would have tried to distance themselves from her memory to remain in favor with the church. But very clearly, this woman is identified as a pope. So if she isn't Sister Manfreda, then who the heck is she? There are a few other possibilities. There is a legendary Pope Joan who may or may not have existed. The most common consensus among historians is that Pope Joan did not really exist, and the Catholic Church vehemently denies that she ever existed. But the more important point is that the medieval audience believed she was real. The first documentation referencing Pope Joan was written sometime in the 1300s and suggested that in the late, 10s, like 1090 or something like that, there was a woman so exceptional and so exceedingly intelligent that she had to disguise herself as a man in order to further her education. She became a highly esteemed scholar and teacher. She eventually rose through the church hierarchy, and when the Pope of her time died, she was elected to replace him. Certainly the church did not know her true identity. Joan served as Pope for several years, probably under the name of either John or Jean or something like that, until her cover was blown when she very inconveniently gave birth during a procession in Siena, Italy. This, of course, did not go over very well with the church. A surprise, surprise. She died very soon after, either from complications from childbirth or, murder. There's also at least the oral tradition that the church rerouted future processionals so as to avoid the street where this happened in order to diminish memory of Joan and that event. I'm primarily going from memory, but I have a vague recollection that I read there still remains a road or avenue in Siena named after Joan, Saint Joan, or Pope Joan, where the infamous processional occurred. Fascinatingly, it is known that up until the 1600s, a bust of Pope Joan was among a sculpture gallery of other popes in a church in Siena, Italy. But sometime in the 1600s, the Catholic Church, in an effort to eliminate all references to Pope Joan, had her bust destroyed. There are still enough paintings of Pope Joan from the Middle Ages to suggest that her existence was at least believed by many to be true, even if the truth of her legend is lost in obscurity. If you do a quick Google search or image search for Pope Joan, you'll find late medieval portraits of her, usually identified her as wearing a triple-tier papal crown and a book. The crown referencing the highest, religious achievement within the church, within the Catholic Church, and the book referencing her as a woman of high learning and education. In one painting, I found her depicted as a woman wearing the triple-tier papal crown and also holding an infant instead of a book. Now, I know what you may be thinking. You may be thinking, well, that Carrie Yale Visconti deck has her holding an infant as well. But remember that this particular rendition of her, the woman is not wearing the triple-tiered crown of the Pope, and she is wearing a secular crown of a queen. Whether Pope Joan was a real person or not, medieval paintings of her are strikingly similar to the Popess of both the Italian and French-style TDM decks. In all images of her in medieval and early Renaissance days, Pope Joan is wearing the three-tiered papal crown and usually always holding a book. Even depictions of her giving birth during the notorious infamous parade still have her wearing the papal crown. As I mentioned, after the 1600s, when the memory of Joan was wiped clean from Catholic memory, the woman in the second arcana of a Tarot deck was referenced more in broad terms as the mother of the church. Even though the church remains a patriarchal system, she may have also been a reference to the Virgin Mary, since there was a strong cult following for the Virgin Mary during medieval and Renaissance days. It's possible that the Visconti's family Popess card is indeed referencing their ancestor Manfreda, but disguising her as Pope Joan, who in the 1400s was still part of Catholic history. Now, I don't know any of this. I didn't know any of this back when I was studying tarot in my early days in the 70s. And when I read Eden Gray's references to the High Priestess as being a very mysterious woman with associations to the Virgin Mary, I found it very difficult in my own mind to reconcile the connection between the Popess card and the Virgin Mary. I knew in my one JJ Swiss tarot deck, which was my first deck of tarot, was a bit off track, because in that deck, the second arcana card was identified as Juno and not as a woman of mystery. My first genuine Marseille deck was probably the Tarot Classic deck here, published around 1974. And she, very confusingly, is titled The High Priestess. I'm guessing the deck publishers thought they were updating the title to make her match the Rider-Waite Smith card of the same name, but the identification of the High Priestess on a TDM deck is an anomaly. But I didn't know that at the time, so when I was learning about the Popess, and this card said she was also known as the High Priestess, my studies were mixed up between female Pope and High Priestess. In my mind, the Virgin Mary was not a woman of mystery. And I grew up in a very religious, devout Catholic family. So it's not like I was an outsider who didn't get it. I mean, I was inside it and didn't get it. I associated the real woman of mystery as Mary Magdalene, and I'll tell you why. Back in the late 1980s or the early 1990s, I had been a docent for the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and I came across a lot of cool gems in their collection that the general public never paid any attention to unless they were pointed out to them. One such painting that fascinated me to no end was a late medieval painting depicting Mary Magdalene in Marseille, France. In fact, the title of the painting is Mary Magdalene Preaching in Marseille. This blew me away, and from then on I began associating the second major arcana card with Mary Magdalene, because that connection made more sense to me than identifying her with the Virgin Mary. This got me researching Mary Magdalene as the probable wife of Jesus Christ, who fled with their children after his crucifixion and ended up in exile in the south of France. This became a fascinating idea to me, and I was influenced by books on the topic, because there were a few books out there. And I became convinced that Mary Magdalene was the Holy Grail, in that she preserved the bloodline of Christ. I wasn't unique in thinking this, and the idea started to infiltrate popular culture in books and movies. And we all know about Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code that came out in 2003. Now, bear in mind that back in the 1970s, when I began my tarot studies, I knew nothing about Pope Joan. So eventually, associating the Popess or High Priestess card with Mary Magdalene is what made the most sense to me. In fact, one of my first tarot online monikers was Magdalene. To me, Magdalene was indeed the bearer of secrets, which explained the book as containing secret information. Because the curtain appeared behind the woman and not in front of her, and I'm guessing that this elaborate gold is, a backdrop, could be a curtain. But clearly by the time we get to Marseille, we see a background curtain hanging. Because the curtain appeared behind the woman and not in front of her, I never thought of that curtain as a veil. Just a really special and extravagant drapery hanging behind a very special woman. Or maybe it was fancy upholstery on a chair she was seated on the back of the chair, that she was seated on. Clearly, she was a very special woman within the church because, of course, she always had the triple tier tiara in every representation of her on these cards, on the TDM cards. Nowhere in my studies have I ever read that the Popess had any identification with Mary Magdalene, so this is not the result of anyone's scholarly research. It's my own personal way of thinking about the Popess or High Priestess. My point being is that we all need to come up with our own identities for the characters, for the tarot characters, to more fully understand who they are. Notice that in all the TDM decks, there are no pillars or columns. Excuse me for messing them up. And in the decks from France, it was only drapery that fell behind the woman. Interestingly, the drapery in all the French decks consistently falls in a scroll pattern. So you see a scroll here, and I'll hold it up. You see how it more or less falls in a scroll on the ends, on the sides. Clearly in the Dodal. So we have curtains that look like they're falling in a scroll pattern. But look what happens when we get to the 1800s and Oswald Worth's deck. Columns suddenly appear behind the scroll drapery. And the drapery is still a little bit scrolled, There's still a scrolled reference to the drapery. It's as though he was beginning to reinterpret the draped fabric as columns, or where did those columns come from? It seems as though the scrolled drapery might have served as an inspiration to add columns. By the time we get to the Waite Coleman Smith deck, excuse my reach, the scrolled columns completely morphed into a pair of columns, a pair of pillars. The pomegranate curtains in the background bear no resemblance to a a scrolled curtain, excuse me. And I've never read anything about the scrolls morphing into the pillars. As far as I know, that's my own observation. But if I thought it, probably other people have too. But I think it's pretty interesting that, these suddenly turn into pillars, right? So why is any of this of any significance? Well, think of how Sister Manfreda, Pope Joan, Mother Mary, or even Mary Magdalene figure into the concept of the number 2. They don't. For some unexplainable reason, the occultists felt the need to match the meanings of the major and minor arcana cards. So along comes Antoine Court de Gebelin, who opened the door for creating myths surrounding the tarot and its origins, and eventually Eliphas Levi, who associated the 22 major arcana cards with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Within this system, the Popess was elevated to high priestess and associated with Beth, the second letter of the Hebrew alphabet. By morphing the curtains into pillars, identifying them as representing Yahin and Boaz, these pillars represent the concepts of positive and negative, yin and yang, the spiritual and the physical, and all other concepts of duality and partnership. The high priestess also appears to do double duty as a woman of mystery. Without those Kabbalistic associations, the second arcana card really has no genuine connection to the number 2, other than it being that number in a deck of cards. And by forcing the issue with an artificial correspondence, an artificial correspondence was created connecting the mysterious woman of the number 2 arcana to match the number 2. Isn't the mysterious woman on the card fascinating enough? Why does an artificial connection to the number 2 have to be made? I've never understood why it was necessary to fabricate a connection between this woman of mystery to agree with the concepts of the number 2. However, I think I'm a minority in feeling this way because many tarot enthusiasts and scholars insist there is a genuine connection between tarot and the Kabbalah. It sounds like I'm dismissing Kabbalistic associations with the cards, and maybe in my own mind I am. But there are a lot of readers who understand and read the cards based on Kabbalistic teachings and or other occult studies who have a tendency to poo-poo those readers like myself, who see those assignments as somewhat artificial and not necessary to reading the Tarot of Marseille or any pip-style tarot deck, really. If occult features and associations make it easier for someone to understand the card's meanings, then they're absolutely valid. But the point I'm hoping to make is that a remarkably accurate and personal connection to the cards does not require anything more elaborate, beyond understanding the images that appear on the TDM-style deck by themselves. I can't stress this enough. The important part about reading TDM cards is having a genuine relationship and understanding with the cards that makes sense to you. And this is probably why the occultists, made those associations, because it probably is what helped them remember the meanings of the cards and to come up with a system that meant something to them. When our intent and understanding is clear and consistent, there is no real need to grab at straws to make artificial or forced connections with the cards. There's no need to memorize elaborate roadmaps beyond what appears on the cards themselves. And that is the beauty of reading TDM. It's absolutely liberating. There's enough beauty and mystery that we don't really have to go out looking for more. If occult symbols or astrological symbols help a reader, or if that's their genuine understanding of the cards, and that if that's what works for them, then that's great. But all I'm saying is that it's not a requirement. And the beauty of reading TDM is that none of that is necessary if you come to grips with what each card means to you. Now, before signing off, I want to go back to the pip cards and touch base on something that I neglected to mention in my magician video. If we look at the two Visconti decks, the Pierpont Morgan and the Carey Yale, we'll notice that though both decks have swords, cups, and coins, they differ with the fourth suit. The Visconti Sforza Pierpont Morgan deck The remaining suit is a stave, capped at both ends with an elaborate ornamentation, whereas in the Carrie Morgan Visconti deck, and I don't know if you can see this because it's such a difficult card to see, appears to be more of like an arrow. So again, this illustrates how natural and prevalent it was for early decks to have variations. When I first began learning tarot, it had been imprinted upon me that during the period of time that the TDM was first created, the 4 suits more or less coincided with the social classes of the time and region. If you recall the aces in my previous video with the magician, the juggler or bateleur, you'll remember that the suit of cups in those early cards strongly resembled cathedrals. So that the suit of cups would have been associated and represent the clergy or spiritual matters makes a lot of sense, especially in Italy, where there would not have been too many people in the population who were not Catholic, given that that's where the Pope hung out, you know. And so the clergy and matters of spirituality would have been a logical association with the suit of cups. Swords would very clearly have been associated with the aristocracy, since knighthood was available only to the upper classes. Coins were associated with the merchants and money handlers, those who exchanged money, and the batons or clubs were associated with the peasants who most certainly worked out of doors with their hands and were not as affluent as the other 3 social classes. In the case of the arrows in the Carrie Yale deck, they might still have been identified as huntsmen who were still outdoorsmen. You know, and a lot of people in this day and age, you know, think that this association with the classes is nonsense. And it may be. It may never have been the intent, you know, and that the suits did not represent these things, or even if they did, you know, represent those things in those days, in these modern times, those associations are outdated or too quaint. But to me, they still make sense. Obviously, our society is much more homogeneous, and we're not as likely to have such rigid class distinctions among ourselves, but we can make parallels to personality types, excuse me, if not class identifications. For example, the general population is much less likely to have a brother or family member in the clergy, but we all know people who are more sensitive and connected to spiritual or mystical concepts. We might not know knights in shining armor anymore, but we all know individuals who might be in the military or police force. We may no longer have a peasant class, but we can certainly identify blue-collar professions and creative people who make things with their hands, or people who are very sports-oriented and maybe physical. And finally, no matter what our position in this world, we all know what money is and the finer things in life that it can buy, like material comfort and education. These suits that may have been created to identify medieval society are still relevant to the human experience 600 or more years later. These associations might be helpful in not only combining a number with a suit to bring understanding, you know, between what the pip number means in relation to its suit, but it might also be helpful in giving life to the court cards, assuming that when they appear, they do represent a specific person or maybe a personality trait. A knight, queen, or king of batons might be descriptive of a real energetic individual who's fun to be with, even if a bit rough around the edges. When I first started learning the cards, I used to identify Lucille Ball's character in I Love Lucy with the Queen of Batons. And as a matter of fact, I kind of still do. And I know that dates me because that was a long time ago. But to me, the Queen of Batons is a fun and a bit mischievous person. She's not an elitist. She's a bit outside of the norm of highfalutin standards. A knight, queen, or king of swords might be someone in the armed forces or associated in some way with the legal profession, and so on and so on. I'm sure you get my idea. The pages of the court might represent youngsters or on any of those trajectories with those tendencies, or whose parents are of those persuasions. Or the pages might even represent news arriving, regarding work, play, law, or romance. Given that the page's role would have been that of an errand runner or messenger, the pages can mean news arriving and not necessarily signify a child. It all depends on the rest of the cards and the question that was posed to the cards. These suit associations are by no means set in stone, or maybe even the original intent, but as long as we have a clear grasp and understanding of what the suits mean to us and how they mesh with the numbered pips and the court cards, and as long as we're consistent, our readings will be accurate. The 4 elements is another association that people might associate to the suits, and I don't think that's too much of a stretch. In fact, I make those associations myself. You'll notice that in the swords of the Marseille decks, they're curved rather than straight. But that's something that I can mention in the next video when I discuss the Empress and the number 3s, because this video is already longer than I had intended it to be. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, because that will encourage me to keep making more. And please feel free to leave comments. I try to answer every comment. To request a reading, please visit tarotclarity.com to read my blog. And to follow me on social media, I'm at the Tarot Reader on Instagram, and I'm at Tarot Clarity on Twitter. And until next time, thank you for watching, and peace.